We all have 5 minutes to get in front of the speaker if you want to watch.
Yeah, we'll be there.
Yeah, no, totally got it. From here.
I'll move.
By the way, what's your name? Randall. Randall. Nice to meet you.
I'm John. I want to make an announcement. I'm looking for a partner for a game that I'm working on.
What kind of partner are you looking for?
Looking for a developer.
Oh, developer.
No poaching. No poaching. Got a demo in Unreal. I'm from Dallas, actually. Yeah, anyone's a really big.
What part of Dallas? That's a new area, Telltale area?
I'm from Lake Hiram.
I was getting drawn to details, just like everyone else.
Right. It's a great spot to spend. There's great food at the end of the night.
We're talking about edible food, right?
Not edible.
Sorry.
Yeah, edible food. I'm a fan of Papa John's.
Alright, we have to respect the event, so I'm gonna hit that. Take your beer.
Oh, dude.
Don't you dare.
No.
Don't spill the beer. I will personally drink some beer.
It's a good beer.
Yes. It's even better on tap.
What are you guys working on?
All of those were
On what is
I work downstairs. I'm here in support.
Well, think of Game of Thrones PvP MMO without Game of Thrones license. Okay, could be a very good one. Gotcha.
We're like EVE Online.
You two? Oh.
I'm the host.
Oh, okay, cool. I'm John.
Also, John, good name.
Cut off by the. Nice to meet you. I came from Dallas just to try to meet somebody to work on a game. I love that.
We will have an opportunity for you to announce yourself.
I was hoping to just like really ending it.
Should have brought one. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for coming out. I'll be your opening act for the evening for everyone else files in. But it's been here for half of you, awesome. Including our speaker. I always turn out that much. But having been, realized after the fact that he was going to be out of the country. No, it's good for him, but we certainly appreciate you coming out and not going to dinner directly from work. And also making your way up here as opposed to the big, much larger party the Capital Factory is throwing downstairs. They do lots of that here. And we're also very grateful to them to provide this space for us without having to pay for it. So also one big hand for Capital Factory. I promise I won't make you applaud that much, but the way this is going to work, you're welcome to, but we are going to speak, and as the name behind you indicates, Ashley Ruhl is our speaker for tonight. But we have a few announcements beforehand. One that has stayed the test of time is the job haves and job have-nots announcements. But there's one thing I wanted to announce to everyone, just because I'm an old journalist, so I pay attention to the news. And there's one thing that I don't think nearly enough people are talking about this week that came out yesterday. How many people here know what FIG is? Okay, very good. About half of you, about the same amount. If you don't know, FIG is like Kickstarter, but specific to games, and they focused on actual investment, not just donations. They started up after the Jobs Act was taken in place by SEC. So some other companies, including locally ACE and Portalarium, are taking advantage of the same SEC securities feds oversight in actual micro investment for video games. It's based in San Francisco, started by a former chief operating officer of Double Fine, guy named Justin Bailey, You kind of need to get in video games with a name like that. Code. Am I too old for that? Anyway, they just announced that their first game. It was funded back in January. Then unfortunately, I don't have a whiteboard behind me, so just pay attention. It's a medieval city builder defender made by a two-man team out of Oregon, and again, they funded it in January. They asked for $15,000. Mind you, they asked for $15,000. Mind you, the two-man team asked for $15,000 to finish the game. They got $108,000 at the end of their campaign. And that doesn't count what Fig calls the slacker backers. They got another $250,000 in investment afterwards. The announcement that came out yesterday on GameIndustry.biz was a little thin on the numbers, but what it said was that 2 weeks after its launch, it had raised $1 million in revenue on sales. Yeah, 2 weeks to sell, bring in $1 million in sales. And that covered the initial investments. Initial investments, I take that to mean the $108,000, not the slacker backers, within 48 hours. And then in the next 2 weeks, it paid back 100% on the initial investment. So again, think about that. They funded it back in January, 8 months ago. It took them 8 months to bring back 100% return on a $100,000 investment. Now, I don't care what it is. That's good money. You know, right here, we're in the heart of industry incubator, high technology, and they did it with one video game. Now, this is not a, they had a whole lot of experience before they went into this venture. It's probably low, low scope for some of the stuff that they had worked on, which includes like Journey and some Madden games. That one of them worked at EA Tiburon for a while. So just think about that, and please look it up because I did link it on the meetup page. But anyway, anyone who's interested in that kind of thing going on, it's possible to actually make money, doing indie games. And there are new ways of doing it all the time, including ways to let people invest rather than just beg for money. Anyway, so let's start on this side of the room. If you are looking for work on this side of the room, please stand up and identify yourself. Please limit yourself to your name, what your aspirations are, if you have a website, and business cards. Anyone on this side of the room? Very good.
Hi.
Hello.
My name is Monica Zabo. It's S-Z-A-B-O. You know my website, monicazabo.com. I'm a programmer. I love developing and stuff like that. Right now I'm working for a marketing company, but I'm hoping to get into video games. That's me.
Thanks a lot. All right, anyone else? We'll move to this side of the room if we don't have anything else. Okay, job seekers, this side of the room. All the way in the back first. That's you. Yeah, Denver.
I'm Eric Nato. I've been in C++ programming for about 3 years. I do some OpenGL and just like to make video games. And I have a website, it's gert.us.
Very good. Santi.
I'm Joseph Santee. I specialize in writing, audio design, dialogue editing, artifacts background. I have business cards and resume. I don't have my website yet. That's for LinkedIn right now.
Very good.
I'm Ricky Yamas, formerly at Arcane. I am a narrative designer and systems designer. Don't working on the website part, but I do have business cards. So,
All right. Anyone else on this side, either side? For those just coming in, we're talking about people seeking jobs, and we're going to go to people seeking room. We had a lot this last time. Hi, Keith.
Possibly.
Possibly.
Still scoping, but Unreal 4 developers, basically gameplay engineers. So I do have business cards. My name is Keith. And I'll give you business cards and shoot me a resume. And once we know our scope, we'll know how many people we need.
Very good.
Thanks.
Part of the reason I have you stand up is so you'll remember each other. Good?
Is that a
Front about it.
Hi, my name is John Busmiller. I am developing a physics-based racing game in Unreal 4. And I'm looking for a developer who's focused on networking and gameplay coding. I have a demo if you're interested, and I'm from Dallas, so talk to me afterwards if so.
Long trip. You driving all the way back there after this?
I'm going tomorrow.
Okay. Got to be safe on the roads. I-35 is not a fun place.
Check it out.
Yeah, we all know that. We have to get around using it. All right. Well, I think that's about all I had to talk about. I can make stuff up, but Beth.
You didn't do this side.
I didn't. Okay.
For jobs.
For jobs. Okay, good point. Is anyone hiring?
I have the hiring management, lead character artist, director of technical art, lead systems designer, QA tester, QA lead, and lead software engineer.
Pulling up a new project.
So it's a certain affinity.
If you're seeking work or, all right. Ashley? All right. We'll introduce our speaker this evening. She is a cinematics designer. Please give one more round of applause for Ashley Ruhl.
Hey everybody. So yeah, I'm a cinematic designer now. It's a very niche field. It involves working mainly with cameras, but it is sort of the bridge between gameplay moments. How can you invest more emotionally in your experience? And I think we all know different cutscenes of what makes a good cutscene, what makes a to give from this talk is just to talk about my experience, what I have found that works, and what I think we can really, take from cutscenes and cinematics and scripted events, and how to increase the emotional investment in your game. So just wanted to define what I think cinematic is for games. It's visual narrative experience as an extension of gameplay told through the established techniques of film, meaning we use the same language that you use that you would use in movies, but used toward an interactive sense, meaning you can't just copy paste from film language. You have to take the language of film and use it in a way that applies to an interactive medium. I'm also going to be focusing on authored cameras. I'm not going to be talking much about cameras that are within player control, so anything that involves scenes with dialogue, anything that's like revealing vistas or big bosses, anything that sets the tone for gameplay, but it takes control away from the player momentarily to create a setting. If you are interested in learning about cameras that are controlled by the player but slightly modified for an emotional effect, I highly recommend this talk from GDC for the new Tomb Raider from Remy Lacoste. It's quite good. So I didn't know cinematic designer was a thing. I graduated as where I was going to shoot for. I was like, I'd shoot for Pixar, I'll end up somewhere around there. But what I really loved doing was creating stories, creating emotional performances, character performances. And I just like telling public down here in BioWare Austin. And he said, hey, we're hiring a cinematic designer. And I was like, I don't know what that is, but I decided to apply anyway. And they liked my animation reel, and they're like, all right, we'll take a shot. And I knew sort of a little bit about film, but I didn't really know that much. I learned kind of along the way and made a ton of side quests and just talking to all the alien speakers and all the different like bronze conversations with, setting up cameras and back and forths and all that. I learned a lot from that experience. So I was there for launch. After that, I went to Trion Worlds in San Diego and worked on the MMO shooter Defiance. And after that, I went to Telltale Games, where I worked on Walking Dead Season 2, Wolf Among Us, Tales From the Borderlands, Minecraft Story Mode, Guardians of the Galaxy, Walking Dead New Frontier, and most recently the second season of Batman, among other things. It's not even all of them. It's a very aggressive schedule. Yeah, so I think you can see most of my experience comes from narrative-driven games, but I think that there's strength in the cinematic presentation that these games offer, that they create an emotional investment that you may not have without the language of film and how we apply it to games. So there are three different kinds. I categorize cinematics into three different types, which is non-interactive, which can be beautiful. They play out the same way every time. They can be super high res. They're basically movies inside your games. I'm completely in awe of everything that Uncharted does because it's so gorgeous, and all the stuff I do is interactive, so we can't go to this level of detail. But the non-interactive ones, you can see all this detail and get very, very, very micro with the detail on those. Scripted events, this is also from Uncharted. The idea being that this is an action that you wouldn't necessarily be able to do in straight gameplay, but by giving you a button prompt and scripting a very short event with the camera, with animation, it creates a more emotional investment in the moment and makes you feel more like a badass in a way that you may not have been able to pull off all that perfect timing in gameplay. But it is just a very small amount of time they take control away from the player and make you feel even cooler. And then the third type is interactive dialogue and interactive action, which is stuff like Telltale Games and BioWare. And these are where the cinematics will diverge, they'll go in crazy different directions, you have different responses, and everybody has emotional reactions based on your responses. It's a very tailored experience, which also creates a lot of content. And so I wanted to talk about, I really feel like Mass Effect 1 brought this sort of cinematic feel into you weren't just watching movies, you were part of the movie. And so in this clip, this is right after character creation in Mass Effect 1. So you've spent, 30 minutes, maybe 2 hours making the perfect Shepard, like this is gonna be me. And then this is immediately following, you step into the world of Mass Effect.
Characters by relays in range. Initiating a transmission sequence. Relay is done. Wiring processor. Board is green.
So I honestly can say, no joke, that this game changed my life and the trilogy changed my life for, sort of related reasons. But what I really took away from this was when I played this, I immediately felt no gameplay, but a short moment before any dialogue happened, before anything, like any action. Why did this make me feel so powerful? There's a couple techniques they're using here in terms of like you're following her perspective, you're walking with her, so you get the there's also a bit of this following behind her, and it doesn't have the reveal of her face until the final moment where you're like, this is the hero of our story. And there's also the feeling that she's walking up to the bridge, she's walking past all these people that are making space for her, they're acknowledging her, she is someone of importance. And all these different things combined with the music and the camera motion just makes you feel like you're already the hero. And this is why I think cinematics are so strong, because they can create this feeling before you get into gameplay. They don't take anything away from the gameplay. They just they enhance the tone of the world that you're entering. So yeah, to that note, like film language, we all watch movies, we all watch TV, and we are all affected by the language of film, even if we don't understand it. We're affected by camera angles, and there's been tons and tons of studies on how camera angles make us feel, like close-ups, and like a close-up makes you feel like you're really intimate with the character, you're really inside their headspace. Wide shots with someone alone, you feel like isolation. We're all affected by the psychology that you play and characters that you know who they are, the personality they are, and that can be about them in their personalities. Like Jacob is just so excited to start a gang. That's his big thing. He's so excited about this, and Evie's like, yay, because she's really more focused and driven on the main plot of the assassins. So she's not super concerned with, barging in and beating people up. She's very focused. But these scenes really tell a lot about the characters, and that in turn affects how you play them. Cinematics also give you the opportunity to create weight. In these two examples, they're both from cinematic. That emotional investment in need to focus more on internal content, what's important. So I think the language of film is very useful for games, but you can't just tell a movie inside a game. You have to understand the purpose of a film is different than the purpose for a game story. Whereas in a film, you're mostly just telling The film, nothing is expected of you except just to watch. So the way you use the cameras, the perspectives you show, like, well, I was just watching the movie, I didn't really care. Kind of touch on some of these techniques a little bit, but this is my little library. Hollywood Camera Work, this is a gift from that. It is one of the driest video series I have ever. Camera movements, depth of field, FOVs and like camera movement and all that. It's great. And yeah, shot by shot in a blink of an eye are both, they focus on storyboarding and pacing and editing and like sequences of shots and how that affects us emotionally. But yeah, if you just went with these, I'll reference some of the techniques they talk about. You'll be good. That's basically, when I didn't really know much about film, this is what I took of them, then your cinematics are not going to be as strong. They are going to pull you out of the experience. They're going to feel like they're wasting time. You're going to feel like, I just want to get back to the game. So the 4 things that I think are important are information delivery, thematic tone, introspection, and player motivation. And I don't necessarily need to do that, but I think that this is what makes them strong. Also, all the clips and references I have from this point on are all my own work, so I'm sort of reflecting on what I've built. So in terms of information delivery, you want to share the perspective of the perspective of your player character. If you show information that your character doesn't have, you're breaking that relationship where it's like, well, I've chosen to do this now that I have this information. It became within their perspective. And in this sense, and also giving the player to act on, not just, where do I go next? What is my next objective? What's my way? In this case, what's my way out? Cinematic sense. This is from the revamped SWTOR intros that we intro, and it's just basically you're going to inhabit. Trying to will make you feel like, okay, I have expectations for the world, and I also have an emotion and introspection for not only your character, but just understanding your relationships with other characters as well. I like to say that cinematics not only show your effect on other characters, but also give you a chance to catch up with how your actions are affecting your character. For example, in this one, this was based on a choice in episode 3 to make Clementine watch something incredibly horrific. And if you choose to do that, you get to see in her face how you're changing her. You're changing her from someone who, you're losing her innocence, basically. You're having her watch this thing and accept that it's okay. And this is a moment that you get to define the player's relationship with the character that they've created. Introspection also in terms of how you're interacting with other characters and how your relationships develop with them and being able to see their faces and see their emotional. Finally, player motivation, which is just cutscenes that are designed to establish challenges and payoffs. The down and this payoff, the cinematics are there to give you an emotional stake. For example, you feel really cool because it was really difficult. It was an emotional state with you when you go into the gameplay. Versus this one on the bottom is from one of the new SWTOR expansions. Basically, it's just a bridge cutscene where you get off the ship and the ship flies off, and then this enemy mob just comes up, and you know that you're mobs. And so what I designed here was just like, well, here I go again, and just but it still creates this feeling of I'm a badass, like I can handle this, and it creates this emotional state that you bring with you into the gameplay. Shots is really important, especially in stuff like Telltale Games that are all just very film heavy. Trying to keep the order of shots based on what the player is thinking about at that moment. What is the information they want next? Whether it's understanding the relationship with someone or new information that's come into play. It's basically just ordering the shots. I try to think about what is the player produce to them that'll make them ask more questions. So that's how I structure my shots. Also defining the relationships with spacing. Characters that are tighter together feel more intimate, but they can also feel like there's a lot of tension there, whereas characters feel more detached from them. I have something going on in the background, or I have somebody doing busy work while the main plot is happening. We can focus on multiple without oversaturating, I think is really important, because then we can and then I just this talk mostly has been me trying to figure out what's my secret sauce, because people keep hiring me to do this and I'm trying to understand what that is. So I'm trying to bring that what makes a good cutscene out and fit into any category. But the idea that the camera is an actor, what the camera shows you is what you're telling the player is important. That the way that you shoot the characters, are you shooting from below, which makes them feel very, very big? Are you shooting from above, which makes them feel very small or very emotionally distant? Are you focusing on close-ups of a character to get really close to their emotional state? Or are you shooting really wide to show off a vista or a world and trying to make everything feel big and grand? That the camera is telling a story. And the camera tells a story incredibly fast, because our eyes receive information so quickly that you can really create a lot of emotional investment beyond just dialogue. This makes the camera an incredibly powerful actor in your scene. Whenever I feel stuck and I don't know what the player will want to do or wants to see next, I just focus on reaction shots, especially on dialogue choices. If my character says well, you're really stupid, and then immediately cut to a reaction of the character I'm talking to, and you see the emotional effect you've had on them. That becomes something that I like to call mental conditionals, because we have conditionals in the game that say, okay, you said this to this person and this may come back later. But we also create mental conditionals where now the player has stored in their head that that's the kind of relationship they've established with this person, and will carry that into every interaction they have with that person moving forward. So creating those reaction shots means that you can see directly how you've affected them, and that really affects how you interact with them and how you interact with the game. One of the biggest things in cinematics is that we deal completely with digital cameras. We do not have any physical cameras, except for that new Unreal thing I saw recently where they actually have a camera rig filming. But everything else is digital, and the biggest problem we have is with a digital camera, you can do anything. You can have flying cameras that go all over the place and crazy zooms, and the thing that always draws you out and makes it feel gamey is when the camera seems to defy physics. So if you can take the camera and make it feel grounded, make it feel like either it's on a dolly or a crane or someone is holding it. If you can make it feel real, like you can't have it move too fast as a person could move, or as fast as a person could zoom. And the more real you can make it feel, the more the scene will feel real, the more the characters will feel like real people. And finally, this is something that I've been working at for a really long time, and there's so much, I think, that comes down to taste and just understanding that we all know what a good scene feels like, what a bad scene feels like, what an epic scene feels like. Oh, that was the coolest thing I ever saw. But you really got to trust yourself to be objective enough to after you've made your scene, back away from it and go, okay, what's working, what's not working, and continue to tweak over and over and over again. Because this is not an exact science. I wish it was. It'd be very easy to teach. But it's very much about trusting yourself and what you think is a good emotional experience. Just how much do you pull out of it and keep coming back to it until it feels right. So using those four categories, I just wanted to show you a couple clips of my own work. How am I for time? Just wondering. Okay. So in this one, this is from Walking Dead Season 2, Episode 1, with Clementine. Clementine has lost everyone. She's been bitten by a dog, she's hungry, she's cold, she's tired, she's alone. And in this scene, I was trying to create something where you feel lost, and you want to try and escape this hopeless situation, but it's mainly just establishing this is the first time Clementine has ever been alone. She's always had people with her, and trying to create this feeling of like you're desperate to get out of it, but sometimes there's just not a way out. So in this scene you see a lot of still cameras because we want to create the feeling of stillness. There's nothing moving, there's no urgency, there's just the silence. And she's, just to emphasize that she's completely alone. Focusing here on the detail of what's the thing that's ailing her the most as she goes through. But yeah, a lot of these still very wide shots make it feel she's very isolated, she's very much alone. And the only time the camera moves a lot is when she's right at the edge of her breakdown, right here where feels like there's no direction that feels right. So the camera's moving around her until she finally decides, I just gotta keep walking, I just gotta keep going in a direction. This one is from Star Wars: The Old Republic, the Knights of the Eternal Throne expansion, one of the most recent. The SWTOR cinematics are interesting because a lot of them are very mechanics driven in that they're introducing new information, or they're not so much they're about the emotional investment, but they're also about feeling like a hero, basically, because you're in the Star Wars universe. It's less about emotional introspection and more about, hey, look at this amazingly cool thing I got to do. So in this example, you have just defeated this humongous droid. It's like 100 feet tall. And you decide that, oh, it'd be really great, we're stuck on this hostile planet with all these other droids. What if we use this giant droid against all the little droids? And the whole point of this cinematic is just to make you feel like the hero of the story. Oops.
Contact. I found my shuttle. Running a pre-flight check. We're in business. Signal's weak, though. I need to be on the roof to boost the connection. We're ready.
The logic circuits are fried. Somebody will have to control this thing from the inside.
Sure you want to hire them alone?
Are you kidding? I'm a walking tank. It's payback time.
Now we know what to get you for Life Day.
So it's focusing a lot on, there's also a lot of camaraderie here. Every BioWare game, I think, really comes down to the companions and, your relationships with them. And so you get a lot of time spent with your companions who are all helping to rebuild this droid. And when they say, oh, someone's going to have to pilot it, you know, from the player's perspective, obviously, like, well, I'm going to be the one to pilot it. So I just silently built this moment where it's like, yeah, of course I'm going to pilot it, and gave the player this, the player character this face of like, here I go, I'm going to do this. It's just about making the player feel like a badass right before they go into the epic gameplay that follows. All right, and the last example I have is this is from Minecraft Story Mode Season 1. This was a very fun series to work on just because it's very cartoony, very kid-friendly, but it's more just about friendship and chaos and you know, it's a lot of fun. So in this scene, they have just entered the Nether. They've never been to the Nether. And it's basically a series of unfortunate events where they're just trying to survive by the skin of their teeth, but it's all facing where it's like a calm moment followed by a crazy moment followed by a calm moment followed by a crazy moment. And the idea is that it's supposed to be comedic, and every moment there are stakes, but the stakes are supposed to be fun and silly.
Oh no! Okay, so I'm not the only one seeing that we're running out of track, right? No? Good.
Jesse, that switch. Now, do it.
Oh, arms don't fail me now. Wow. I thought something bad was going to happen there, but I guess everything's going to be... Whoa!
Jesse!
No!
Wait!
Oh, man! Axel? Olivia? Ruben? Hang on, Ruben! Okay, Ruben, remember how I said everything was going to be just fine before? I know I was wrong then, but I have a very good... Whoa! Doc!
And it goes on like that for another 3 minutes. But this was also in Telltale action scene fashion. This is something that has to have all the prompts here that are very clear. The information is very clear of what you're supposed to do, but at the same time, it needs to feel chaotic and crazy. Just enough time, just enough of a camera angle to give you the information without feeling like this is the thing you're supposed to do next and focusing on that detail. You want the camera to continue to move. You want everything to feel like, you know, the cart's going super fast, the directions are going crazy. This is also a lot about protecting your friends, mainly Ruben, his pet pig, for the player to try and protect Ruben, and so that's what motivates you to get into those combat scenes with the skeleton. And but yeah, it's just about rapid movement and moments of quiet and chaos, just for comedic effect. So I know that most people don't know where cinematic designers come from, and it's a very small niche field because most companies that have like really beautiful detailed cinematics that play the same way every time have very small teams. They tend to have, well, not the team in general, but their cinematic team tends to be a director and maybe a couple of animators and some technical people. So it's usually between like 5 and 15 people that create these. So like stuff like The Last of Us, Uncharted, the Rockstar games, those have smaller teams. But where cinematic designers come from, say your content has a lot of diverging storylines where suddenly you have 3 different branches because you gave players choices. You have dialogue choices where you need characters to react to everything you say in a different way. You have voice and cameras for side missions, which was SWTOR, SWTOR is like one of the largest VO undertakings in games ever. It's English, French, and German, and it's 8 single-player storylines with 2 genders each, so it's huge. So there was a lot of work there. or you're doing episodic production where you're constantly releasing cinematic experience on smaller deadlines. This creates a lot of work, whereas a game like The Last of Us has about 8 hours of cinematic experience. Something like Mass Effect can have upwards of 30. So it's something that a small team cannot manage. So that's where cinematic designers come in. We're given an animation library, we're given a camera system animation library and a timeline editor. Basically, we're given a library of animations that range from locomotion, where you're walking through a space, turns, gestures like hand gestures, smiles, blinks, head turns, everything under the sun, and we create recycled performances out of this library so that we have all the content we need to create multiple performances. We'll get custom stuff for very specific moments where someone needs to hand you a key or there's a very specific fight moment, but for the most part, a lot of the back and forth conversations are done just with all the content we normally have. And if you want a little bit more of a detailed look into what cinematic designers do, they touch a little bit on this in this video, which I liked because it's like the only video when people ask me, so what is your job? I'm like, I just point at that video because that explains it better. And so this is kind of a basic look at what I have. It's a timeline of objects and blocks that I edit. Blocks that include animations, they include VO, they include effects, and yeah, it's basically just editing on a timeline. This is an example from the StarCraft editor. You can see it gets very complicated very quickly. But the nice thing about cinematics is that every company uses their own proprietary thing. So if you go into cinematics, you just gotta kind of understand the workflow and then just learn the tool along the way. So you're never really expected to know the tool going in. And this example is probably one of my favorites. This is from The Witcher 3, and you can see here they take an animation gesture of him doing this arm motion, and they scale it so that based on whatever line he's saying, a longer gesture is more appropriate. And this is pretty much exactly what I do. I just take animations, multiple animations, and layer them on top of each other to create new performances every time. So if you are looking at building your own cinematic toolkit, basically the things you start with is an animation library, like I mentioned. It includes body and facial moods, locomotion, conversational gestures, brow animations, head turns, everything you need to have a basic conversation. The key to all, though, is that the animations on the whole are additive. Idea being, if you have a posture where their arms are, it will add on to it. It won't pop the arm back down and bring it back up. That's what creates the very recyclable performances, because the additive animations just mean that they add on to each other and they create new performances every time. You need a camera system that is able to set field of view, because games tend to have very high FOV, obviously, for gameplay, but in cinematics you want something tighter, like up to 120 millimeter, to make it feel more cinematic. You also want to, if you can, depth of field really makes it feel like film, because cameras, when they have longer lenses, can't make sure everything is in focus. So if you can create a depth of field system where stuff in the background is blurred out or stuff in the foreground is blurred out while stuff in the back is clear, that makes it feel more like film. And a timeline editor that just brings it all together. And like in this example, basically everything is just blocks. Blocks that you can scale, split, duplicate, loop, all that fun stuff. And you basically have the basics of a cinematic editor. If you are interested in cinematics as a career, it's kind of a catch-all, because it's both film, but also animation, character performance, but also game design. You basically need to know how to be that bridge. You need to understand how to create an experience that brings players, either rewards them for the experience they just had, or brings them into the next experience. Always making sure that you're focused on what is it that the player wants out of this game, and how can I make it feel really, really epic, or really intense, or really anxious, depending on what the emotional state of your game is. And in terms of making things, just making stories really comes down to it, as much as you can do non-verbally. 11 Second Club is where I got started because that's character animation. They basically have a different sound clip every month that's 11 seconds, and you can animate in anything, and then they judge it at the end of the month. They give that feedback. But that's really good for understanding how people talk to one another. Like a big portion of cinematics is just understanding how we communicate non-verbally, whether it's eyebrow raises or just these micro expressions that pass over our faces. Understanding those will make your cinematics even stronger. And if you are interested in looking at a cinematic tool set that's available, the Dragon Age Origins tool set is free online, and it's basically the same kind of workflow that I have now today, just simplified. Actually, when I worked at Trion, they based the cinematic tool. We made a new one from scratch, and my lead basically just handed the Dragon Age tool to him and said, "Make this," and just repeat that. So it all kind of comes back down to the same formula every time. So, concluding, cinematics is a very cool, very niche field, but that incorporates a lot of stuff. You got to be able to have your characters emote and feel like people. You have to edit your shots well. You have to direct the scene, direct where the player is going, and understand what they want out of your cinematics. You also have to see what you're bridging between in terms of gameplay. What are you coming out of? What are you going into? And I really think that cinematics are a great addition to games, just that they create an emotional investment that may not be there otherwise. They're just enhancing our experience. They are making our worlds feel more real, feel more emotionally intense. And finally, that the stories that we do tell in cinematics have to feel motivating. They have to feel like you are a part of the world. You're not just watching it, you're living it. So everything you create has to feel like it's gearing you towards interacting with the world and not just observing it. And that's all I got. Thanks.
Thank you, Ashley. Let's take a break on your timepieces. Count down 10 minutes from now. Check the plumbing, get another drink, and we'll be back with Q&A. It's definitely the most dynamic slideshow we've had.
Oh, really?
No one's ever done video, but I guess you kind of need it to.
Yeah, it's kind of the main part of it.
We'll have a lot, and also at the same time, you're trying to explain yourself, but also justify it.
Yeah.
Cutscenes are not, a lot of gamers, at least by rogue, they don't like it. But I think they appreciate it doing so well.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like people go, I think a lot of designers go, "Oh, cinematics are a cheap way of telling your story," but it's like, but they're also a very convenient shorthand.
Yes.
And they make it easier. Like until we have a good replacement, I think they're the best shorthand
Like you said,
they've got.
people are, sometimes you don't need everything to be interactive. If you let the player do anything they can imagine, they go off the rails and you can't control it at all.
Yeah, and you can't really control the tone you're setting.
You need to make them feel empowered, but not absolutely empowered.
Right.
I have. Give me another drink.
I'm good. I think I'm gonna stop at the restroom.
Okay.
Where's the restroom?
Back out the hallway, turn right, and then right forward. Capital Factory primarily
we should do it, right? Just because we just want that brand system, we should totally control it. We want the brand so
we might have had it in there.
You're right, you should play it.
Practice treating yourself like a human being.
Well, it was so much that I think they don't know how to sell, right? No, but I mean, the mechanic was but the mechanic was already mobile. It's a natural.
They talk about how there's 750 games platform. More games have got a billion sales, which is true, and there are like 700 million of those. Like everyone right now, they're playing Pokemon.
It's kind of just like a go where like 5 years ago, Facebook went with it. It was
They were trying to get them
Where at?
All right, could I draw everyone back to your seats, please? We'll get back started. A couple things I forgot to say. For those of you not aware, we do live in Austin, and that means that there's stuff going on all the time, and we have to judge how to spend our free time. There is a thing called the Austin Game Dev Calendar. It is a Twitter account that talks to a Facebook account that talks to a Google account. It's ATX Game Dev Cal, C-A-L, as in calendar. And that's the easiest way I know how to reference that. If you're not on that, you need to be, because again, stuff going on all the time. Also, I would like to plug the Bullock Texas State History Museum. Right now, just launched Pong to Pokemon, the evolution of video games. It is excellent. It is in the rotating exhibit space on the 3rd floor rotunda space. And it's actually really well done. It has no rhyme or reason. You won't think that you're going through a timeline of anything. It's got you know, controllers and VR exhibits in front of Zork, the text game. But it's all excellent. So I've had multiple game developers say, this validates me. Like, really? I mean, what was interesting to me is that people are really excited to play 30-year-old console games when it's in a museum. It's like, Super Mario Brothers, yeah. Okay. But anyway, let's bring Ashley back up here. That is at the Bullock State History Museum, north of the Capitol building downtown. So, and also, if you go on the first Sunday of the month, which was last Sunday, HEB picks up your tab. So, anyway, back to Ashley. Questions for Ashley?
Any questions? Yes.
So I start?
Yeah.
Okay. So as a cinematic designer, what is the biggest challenge going through the end-to-end process from gathering requirements of what's needed for the cinematic to prototyping to staging to final validation?
The hardest part of building the cinematic, I'd say probably getting the staging right, the first playable staging right. Just making sure I understand the blocking and what will feel natural for the characters while also furthering the plot, while also taking into account what the director wants. And at Telltale, we get individual scenes. So I have my scene, but I'd be under a director who is controlling the whole episode, who is under another director who's controlling the whole season. So how do I hit all of their needs while also hitting what I think the characters need for these specific emotional beats? And plotting that out in my head, basically like looking at it like football plays in my head, like, okay, they start here and then they move over here, but then she looks back over there, and like figuring out where the camera's gonna be, if I need to flip the 180 line at any point. Basically, like if you have, I don't know if you all know what the 180 line is, but if you have two characters, the camera always stays on this side of them. That's the 180 rule. You don't put it over here unless you have a camera motion that moves over to the other side. But yeah, just keeping all of that in mind and like making sure I have this ballet choreographed in my head, and then once I get that all out and blocked out, then everything after there feels really smooth. The only other difficult thing is when they rewrite a whole chunk of the scene and I go, well, okay, they didn't go over here, so now they gotta find a different way to get over there. And that's usually, and that happens a lot at Telltale because they're very iterative and very fluid. So being able to jump on changes and react quickly is difficult but necessary.
Actually, what I wanted to know was related to that. Like you talked about how your workflow, what are they giving you? Like you said, you had directors upon directors, but I'm assuming a script, and I'm assuming like the start and end of what needs to happen. Is there anything more to that?
It's a dialogue file, which will have all the lines laid out, and then I have cinematic files within that dialogue file that connect to, you know, and sort of, yeah, like I said, choreograph it in my head. So I get the dialogue, hopefully voice, not always, but I gotta kind of just work with that.
You do prefer having voice before you go to work?
Yeah, okay. No. I like to be able to hear the performance because I think that really informs the way they move, the way they act. You know, if they're going to walk slowly or they're going to turn quickly, the way the voice actor delivers the lines really affects their performance, which also affects the camera work.
I'm just the host. Keep talking.
Way in the back.
Do you typically have enough time to do 3 different takes, or as many takes as you feel like you might want to explore different angles on a shot or different ways that things could go out? Because it seems like when you're building the scene, you're building the blocking. That seems to set a foundation. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you build on top of that with the animations and how they move through the
Yeah, no, it's a lot of nailing it down, what doesn't work, switch it up a little bit. But I've never really had the opportunity to just, I'm going to try it 3 different ways. But I will do micro versions of that, where I will just play around in the tool and be like, well, what if I pull the camera over here? And I just test it really quick and bounce around and like, oh, that's a really cool shot. I got to fit that in somewhere. With things as I go along.
So on the other side of the coin, as you know, is a level designer. In your mind, how do you decide whether to make something more cinematic or make it more interactive?
That's a good question. I think it's dictated by what the purpose of the cinematic is, and I think that comes down to like the gameplay, whatever is happening next. If it's a very combat-heavy experience, I'm going to try and gear more towards, okay, what information are they looking for? Because their mind's already twitchy. They're already looking for the next piece of information of what do I need to get to the next thing, or there's this giant monster jumping out. I focus more on expository and trying to create the emotional experience, but within information that they'd use pragmatically, versus something like a Telltale game that's more about your companions, anything that has to do with companion relationships, that kind of stuff. Then I'll try to go a little bit more cinematic. Also, I go more cinematic definitely in moments where it's like a payoff, like you killed a giant boss, or you uncovered this whole new way. Then
You mentioned having a couple of drawing skills would be useful, and I guess my question is, where do you marry those things? Do you do thumbnails? Do you thumbnail out a scene first, or kind of have a grasp on characters, or is it more for draw or stuff like that?
I know a lot of cinematic designers that do storyboards. They'll storyboard out their scene to like draw it out. I keep it all in my brain. I'm not great at drawing, but I think understanding perspective drawing and having some experience in that is really important. I think as much as you need to draw it out, you draw it out as much as you need to in order to understand the idea you're trying to create and test. Drawing is cheap, it's fast. If you have that ability, then you can try out a bunch of ideas really quickly. For me, I definitely like exploring the scenes more, because I think in 2D you can cheat a lot in terms of perspective and like the way things are, the distance between objects and stuff like that, whereas I just like to play around in the tool. It's kind of like a machinima perspective, because you're like, okay, I'm in this world, all right, what looks good, just like walk around in it and explore what options I have.
Cool, thank you.
You'd mentioned the different places follow a very similar workflow, but the tools are very different. But you also gave suggestions on ways for people to sort of get in and try their hand at things. Are there specific game engines or add-on tools or whatever that are sort of openly available to people to play with and practice?
That's a good question. I don't know of any. I know the one thing I've been really curious about that I haven't done a lot of exploring into is in Unity, their new timeline thing, which had a bunch of names before that, and I really don't like the name timeline because it's vague. It's very vague. It used to be called like director mode, and then it was called sequencer, but now it's timeline. But that is all about creating short timelines, and timelines you can embed into other timelines, so you can create small scenes that just play in your game, or you can create a cut scene where you control the camera and control the player. The other thing I'm really in procedural cameras, but it's cameras that you can create, you can establish the relationships between objects and create a cinematic look, but also, because that way you can create a cinematic experience without having to author every single camera, as well as leave a little bit of freedom for the player to move around. But yeah, I think those, I don't really know, besides the Dragon Age tool that you can play with for free, I don't know of a lot of stuff besides those two that really mirror the same experience.
Mm-hmm. What do you kind of see as, I guess, the future of cinematics? I mean, for a while they were just movies, and then I think like during the Half-Life 2 era, you kind of saw them go away, and it's like, oh, let's just give players control, and then God of War brought in quick time events, and I think now we've decided that we don't really like QuickTime events that much. Like, do you see it moving in a particular direction?
I think that there are good experiences and bad experiences of all of that. I think that the stuff that Uncharted is doing, The Last of Us is doing, they're creating what feels like a cinematic experience and pulling it out of a cutscene and into gameplay. That's more, and Tomb Raider as well. Tomb Raider is a beautiful example of that, where we're still creating these emotional investment moments, but I still don't think we have anything that really replaces cutscenes in terms of emotional investment, especially being able to see a character's face. The way we play games, the way most games are played, we're playing over the shoulder. We can't see the expression of our character, can't see what they're feeling at any given moment. Tomb Raider does a great job of that, constantly moving the camera where you can see Lara Croft's face. I think it all comes down to how much time do you have to make it as interactive as possible. The stuff like Tomb Raider and Uncharted and The Last of Us, they have a lot of time to really hone that in. And I think the same thing goes for QuickTime events. There are some really great QuickTime events out there, and there's some really bad ones. It's just how much time are you investing to make those QuickTime events feel like they were the thing you wanted to do next. You know, before the prompt comes up, it's like, I really need to, pull on this rope, and then a QuickTime event comes up that mimics that feeling, and you're like, yes, this is what I wanted. It's like trying to understand the player psychology there. In terms of where they're going, I'm honestly not sure, but I don't think they're going away anytime soon in the way that we know them. Because even like Uncharted and Last of Us have cutscenes, just like straight movie bits, and they're still really powerful, make people very emotional, and I don't think we really have a replacement for that in gameplay.
So how does that work?
Yeah, pretty much. I have iterative passes, so I'll have a first playable pass, and then I'll have multiple meetings with the director, like every week to 2 weeks. They'll see where I'm going, the direction I'm going. And the nice thing is, at least at Telltale, the directors all come from the cinematics department, so they have a better eye for like, okay, I see where you're going with this. And then we also would have reviews with the executives. We'd have a first playable review, a ratings review, and then a final review, where they would play the whole episode, direct all their questions to the director, who would then disseminate that to the cinematic designers. So it's definitely an iterative process where they check in. It's like, it's much easier to change the blocking from over here to over here in the first week you're working on it than if you like made this beautiful, perfect scene. They go, it'd be more cool if it was over there, and then you have to redo everything. But yeah, it's definitely very iterative.
Do you work with other cinematic designers as well? Like, do you talk to them and go, hey, what do you do for this character? Do you think this looks right, or is there any kind of...
Yeah, definitely. I think that we would ask each other questions like that. Just, does this feel right? Did you understand what was happening in this shot, or did you feel this way during the shot? Sometimes, though, at Telltale, you get a scene that's so huge, you have to work with another person to build it, and that's always the hardest because everybody has a different workflow. And trying to say, okay, well, where's our linking point? Okay, so I'm going to have them stop here, and then you will have them continue there, and be that glue, while also maintaining a stylistic choice in terms of how are we shooting the characters in this scene, how close are we with our close-ups, or what's the relationship between these characters, that kind of thing. So mostly it's communication with the director, but often we have communication within the department.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Two things. One, can we get your information back on?
Yeah.
Second, in the last couple of years, what has been one of your favorite cinematics to work on that was the biggest challenge as well, and how do you overcome that challenge?
That's a good question. I think it was one of the hardest things for me was that Clementine one with the horrific thing you make her watch, which I don't want to spoil because it's awful. But it was one of the most grotesque things that they'd ever done in Walking Dead. And I am not a horror person. I'm not a zombie person. I don't like any of that. And like I like cutesy Looney Tunes stuff, and I was like, okay, but I really want to deliver on this. I want the payoff here to feel like you did this as a player. You chose this. You chose to make Clementine watch this, and this is the kind of character she's becoming because of it. And that was that was very challenging for me, but I was like, I want to learn how to do horror. And so I worked a lot with my director, and he gave me some references in terms of stuff to watch. I can't remember what he gave me off the top of my head, but a lot of like understanding fast cuts to feel like this jarring feeling, because it can't really give it away. It's very violent and very gross, but trying so hard to like bounce between this horrible thing that's happening in her face and this horrible thing that's happening in her face, and like understanding that relationship of imagery, where it's less about it's about her perspective, but it's also the putting shots next to each other. It's like, what feeling do you have when you put these two things next to each other? And that was incredibly challenging for me, and I was going back and forth with my director a lot to get that just right. But I feel like I nailed it pretty well. So that was one of my favorites.
There's a key emotion. Sorry, real quick. There's a key emotion tied to that. Do you feel like you're able to deliver on that key emotion in that scene?
I think so. The best part for me, I think, one of the best parts of working at Telltale is everybody plays Let's Plays on YouTube, so I can watch people play my games and emotionally react to the scenes that I've created. I'll just go to my scene and go, okay, that worked, that didn't quite work. That's how I like iterate. I can look at the exact content I created and see their reaction to it. I had, in episode 5, there was, they walk across a frozen lake, and I did the scene where like it's super tense because they're like, oh, we don't know if it's gonna break. And this one girl, girl from Oz, I think is the streamer, she actually had a heart rate monitor while she was playing the scene, and you could see it just jump up, and like she's freaking out, and I'm like, yes, yes, yes. That was exactly what I wanted you to feel. So yeah, that's always great feedback for me, because I can be like, oh, or someone laughs at a thing, I'm like, you're not supposed to laugh at that, but you know, that helps me learn what kind of effect I'm having on players.
So, in your professional opinion, should you spend money on film school, or should you just stay home and watch YouTube videos?
I'd say watch the videos and read the books that I suggested, and if you feel like you still don't have enough, then go to film school, but those are probably the best places to start. But honestly, in terms of games, in pretty much every creative field, just making things is the biggest thing. That you learn the most when you try to make it, and you make it and you get feedback and you iterate on your own work, because you can read and read and read about a million things, but unless you're reading things with the goal of making something, you're just gonna get stuck, because there's infinite knowledge to be had. And honestly, like I'm glad I went to school, but I'm more happy that I went to school for my liberal arts degree than for my animation degree, because my animation was nowhere near ready for the professional level, but my liberal arts education gave me a broader foundation of understanding world ethics and psychology and all this other stuff that I could bring into my work. So that's what I would go to school for.
Do you have any other examples of really fantastic games, like with the cinematography? I played Mass Effect 1 and I completely agree on that one, so I was just wondering if you had any others.
Yeah, like I mentioned, Tomb Raider. Tomb Raider is really great. I think that there's a fine line to walk in that there are some games like the Metal Gear Solid series where they're very film focused, but they're not necessarily game focused. There's a dissonance between their cinematics and their gameplay, which doesn't always rub me the right way. I think that stuff like Tomb Raider, for example, I just I haven't gushed about it enough, but Tomb Raider, their gameplay cameras are really cinematic, but they're not like blow you away, the best film you've ever seen cinematic, but they do make you feel emotionally invested. So it's not necessarily about what has the greatest cinematography, it's the stuff that makes you feel the most, in my opinion. I think definitely Tomb Raider. I like Journey, honestly. Even though Journey is a gameplay camera, there are some moments that they sort of guide it. They guide the camera in a way that gives you the one vista in the race down the hill, where you see the sunlight, or the sun shining through the pillars and stuff. It's so pretty. Yeah, I think anything from BioWare, really, they're always looking at making that as cinematic and as emotional as it can be in terms of, you know, investment. Excuse me,
Which
investment.
Tomb Raider are you talking about?
Sorry, the new one from was it 2013? The one the one that Crystal Dynamics made. They recently made a sequel that I haven't played, but it's just called Tomb Raider, which is super convenient. But it's the new one, the new reboot.
And would you mind going back to your Clementine slide from the examples?
Yeah.
Thank you.
This will all be up on YouTube eventually, so.
What? This is dumb. I can do this.
Yeah.
This one? Or
Yes, that one.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
So most of your talk has been about making the player feel empowered, in your words, feel badass. But
Mhm.
obviously, horror is not about that, and Walking Dead's kind of a unique game in that regard because it's a playable horror game. So when is it appropriate to make the player feel less empowered, and why would you want to do that?
That's a good point. I think it's less about. There are definitely times you want the player to feel empowered, but there's also times you want the player to feel, like, full stop. And whether that's anxiety in a horror game where you don't know what's around the next corner, you don't know, you know, if you're going to survive. Survival is like one of our basest motivators in terms of games and cinematics. Like, you look at the first season of Walking Dead, almost everything that drives you is, I gotta survive to the next moment. But then once you get past that, it's, I have to protect this little girl and, you know, be a good role model for her even in this horrible time. Yeah, I think that it's definitely whatever your experience is going for. You just have to, like, if you think, okay, I need them to feel anxious here, or I need them to feel unsettled, or I need them to feel desperate is another good one, where everything, especially Tomb Raider. Tomb Raider is I keep talking about Tomb Raider. Tomb Raider is a perfect example of that, because so much in, like, the first third of the game, everything's going to hell. It is the worst experience, especially every time she dies. It's like the most grotesque thing you've ever seen. But she is trying to survive by the skin of her teeth, and every moment feels like it could be the last moment. And then as you get better and better and better, you start to feel more empowered. You feel like you have the strength, you have the abilities to survive, but the first third of the game is just establishing you don't know what you're doing. Trying to evolve, I think that emotional arc is probably the strongest performance you can get in a game.
Any other questions?
Anything else?
We got time.
I guess, what are your thoughts on games like Heavy Rain and Beyond Two Souls, which are so cinematic heavy, but I think still give the player a lot of camera control, for example, even during the cinematics, if I'm remembering correctly.
I really like when we can bring as much of a cinematic feel into gameplay as possible. It takes a lot of programming and a lot of tools to get that right. My only gripe with those series is that they also, like, they make the QTEs feel arbitrary. They don't feel very connected to the world, and they also focus more on the cinematic performance than they do the interaction. And it's more about telling a story at you rather than, you know, making it your story.
There are the
I mean, I got a whole bag of How about this? You actually mentioned that you were working really tight with with one of the directors, and this person was giving you some really strong feedback. I'm curious, what's the kind of feedback that gives you the most ability to execute and be productive? Like, what does that feedback look like? And then how do you communicate that with people who are trying to give you direction, but they don't know how to best give you that feedback?
This could apply to everything, any field. I think always focusing on the why and not the how. That's probably the basic, the most simplest version of that. Because I directed 2 episodes, and what I found was I don't need to tell people this is how I want them to act in the scene, and this is what I want the player to be driven by at this moment. Make that happen. And I'll, you know, if they want suggestions, I'll offer them. But I think it's important to give people the freedom to use, you know, their talents to build that solution. And then when it doesn't quite work, sort of guide them like, okay, this is working, this isn't, but giving people the freedom to flex their creative muscles. On the receiving end, if I get very specific feedback that doesn't really direction, I always try to clarify it. Like they say, can you tell me why you need that? And then they go, because the always enables me to do better than just doesn't really help me as much as, you know, we need to space out the scene, or, you know, this is where this action is going to happen, this explosion is going to happen over here. So yeah, that's the basics of it. Yeah, or the back there, yeah.
Do you feel that, I guess, your cinematics in video games are restricted by the ideas of cinematics in cinema, just as how theater restricted cinema by what people thought, like, oh, this is how cinema works because I've seen theater, trying to translate into that? Do you think there's things that haven't been explored or should be explored but aren't able to be explored because of people's expectations based off of what they see in movies?
That's a good question. I think we're always pushing that boundary. I think that there are certain expectations for cinematics, but I think that really comes down to what expectations you set for the player at the beginning. Like, you know, Hideo Kojima will set up, hey, you're going to be watching this for a really long time, and that's kind of his thing. Whereas active moments and QTEs and action scenes. But yeah, I think there are definitely things we can explore. I want to see more technology seamlessly guide us between scripted events and completely player-controlled events. And I think the thing that holds us the hardest is that the narrative structure of a film does not match the narrative structure of a game. That a film is paced. A film has a direction. It has a overall theme, and it has the whole thing is edited so you feel from front to back. It's a full story. I didn't feel like it was dragging at any point. Blah blah blah. Gameplay changes that. It changes, like, okay, well, now I'm going to have 10 hours of wandering around and shooting things, and then I'm going to have this little cutscene, and then I'm going to wander around, and then I'm going to have this cutscene. We have to understand, like, and I think narrative designers have really explored this much further than I have, but we have to understand that pacing, that relationship. That's also why I don't think it's ever worked to make a movie from a video game, because a video game story is fundamentally different in how it's told than in a film, unless you're telling like something from the world rather than retelling the game. You know, it's a fundamentally different narrative experience. But I definitely think there's more we can explore with that. We just have to create a better understanding of what that narrative pacing looks like.
Just a side note on that. Do you think, with that in mind, that time can be used a lot more to tell a story rather than films, and straight from beginning to end? Within a video game, you can go back. Do you think that can be used more? Or do you think that can be used more? Or do you think that can be used more? Or do you think that can be used more?
Mm-hmm.
Or do you think that can be used more? Or do you think that can be used more? Or do you think that can be used more? Or do you think that can be used more? Or do you think that can be used more? Or do you think that can be used more? Or do you think that can be used more? Or do you think that can be used more? Or do you think that can be used more? Or do you think that can be used more? Or do you think that can be used more? Or do you think that can be used more? Or do you think that can be used more? Or do you think that can be used more? Or do you think that can be used more? Or do you think that can be used more? Or do you think that can be used more? Or do you think that can be used more? Or do you think that can be used more? Or do you think that can be used more? Or do you think that can be used more? Or do you think that can be used more? Or do you think that can be used more? Or do you think that can be used more? Or do you think that can be used
Yeah, I think that it's interesting because games can feel more like real life than movies can, because movies cut out the fat. They cut out every amount of time of driving from this place to this place unless it has plot relevant points, you know, or taking an elevator, or even going through a door. They just cut all that out because it's not relevant to the story they're telling. But in games, we live all those moments, and we live the dead space in between the important moments. I think we have an opportunity in games to tell stories that feel closer to our real lives than film does, because film has been designed to be very compact and just quick to get through everything.
You mentioned the original Mass Effect trilogy as one of the sort of watersheds of the changing role of cinematics and stuff. I'm curious if you have a particular scene from the original trilogy that didn't work, and why?
That's a good question. It's funny because I'm going back and replaying the trilogy now. There's definitely, I don't know if there's a specific scene, but there is a bit of a dissonance between the epic moments where you're moving through the space, like the intro movie where you're moving into the space and every minutes. It's like, yeah, I love talking to these people and it's a cool conversation, but wouldn't it be great if they moved around and had busy work and felt like people instead of robots that are dispensing information at me? Like, there was always this, I feel like it's always more expensive to do that, but I feel like it's really important to make them feel like people, to keep them moving. So yeah, I think that was one of the conceits that I just kind of just washed over as I played through, but that was something that I think they look up, hello, Beacon Point, tell me stories. You want them to feel more like people, and that means they have to be doing something with their time besides just staring at you and talking at you.
My former question, do you have any examples from film, like from Hollywood films, that are really excellent cinematography that stand out?
That's a good question. In relating to games, I honestly think Mad Max Fury Road is perfect. It's I actually when I was directing on Tales from the Borderlands, we took the whole cinematic team to go see that as kind of fuel to keep going with our very aggressive schedule. We're like, hey, let's go watch Mad Max, and it's very much in the Borderlands field. But that movie is not only beautifully shot, but all the information is clear, even as it's moving very rapidly, which I think is very relevant to games, because you want to be able to give as much information as you can and in a small time span that the player can take it and move on with it. I think. I mean, that's the first one I can think off the top of my head.
Any favorites that just overall stand out? If not, that's fine.
Yeah, I can't really think of many other favorites, but if you message me on Twitter, I can probably come up with more. I'll bring that.
Just avoid the Star Wars prequels. A camera, B camera. People on a couch. People walking.
Yeah, that's called lazy staging. That you have to, you can't just. That's another thing too. Like, this is more just nitty gritty of cinematics work, but you can't just have people going back and pacing and as they're talking to you and explaining their whole backstory to you. It's like, no, they gotta have a direction. They gotta have a purpose for doing that. You can't just have a camera that's sort of slowly panning around the scene. It's like, no, give the camera direction, give it purpose. Because if it doesn't have purpose, then it's literally telling you, hey, this is filler, I didn't know what to do here. And so it's like, well, why am I watching it then? Everything should have a purpose.
Does creating the scenes like this detail make it harder to watch scenes in video games?
Yes. yes, it does. Yeah, no, it totally does. I actually went back after working at Telltale for 2 years to play Dragon Age Inquisition, and well, the camera work is great. I mean, it's a BioWare game, but they also, they were very crunched for time, so a lot of stuff is thrown in there. What drove me nuts was the facial performances. They just weren't human. They were robots with flapping lips, and it was, yeah, I definitely catch not only like camera work, but also just character performance. And it's all in the eyes. If you can't make the eyes feel human and the brows move and the blinks, then you got a robot. You don't have a person there.
Yeah, I've heard that's been something pretty difficult. Is the more real games get, the more you have to start getting down to those details. And if you're too good at it, you can create an uncanny valley feel that brings you out of the game.
Yeah, and I mean, I personally counter with, you can make a more emotionally engaging character with a cartoony look than you can with someone where you can see every single skin pore. Like, if you can emote subtle rather than what you see, like rather than what you see on their face, that's going to be more emotionally engaging than if you perfectly captured an actual human's performance.
Maybe one more question.
Critical on the Metal Gear 6 series. I was wondering if you played 5 and their take on almost zero cuts with cameras. It was all scenes between cinematics to gameplay. Kind of what your thoughts with that, because I thought it was pretty groundbreaking, because it's the only time you could have this hour-long epic and there's zero cuts between the whole thing. So I was wondering if you actually played it, your thoughts on it.
I actually haven't played that one, but I am a fan of zero cuts and just going in between gameplay and cinematic as seamlessly as possible. I'm more commenting on the older series, where my sister would be like, "Oh, I'm gonna sit down for 40 minutes and watch a movie." I'm like, "I thought you were playing a game." She's like, "I am playing a game."
I would suggest checking out Peace Walker, or not Peace Walker, but
yeah, Peace Walker.
That was a different thing. But what is it? The prologue before
Ground
5.
Zeroes.
Ground Zeroes. Because there are zero cuts in that.
Mhm.
It's pretty remarkable. It's only 3 hours, 4 hours, but it's very great cinematography.
There is something to be said though for camera cuts. Like, if you remember the first 12 minutes of Gravity, camera cuts can be very uncomfortable because camera cuts have become blinks. Camera cuts divide thoughts. They divide process of thought, where you can separate ideas based on cuts. And without cuts, it starts to feel like you can never take a breath. You never have that thought interrupted, which, you know, is very cool technologically speaking, but it can also be very emotionally jarring because you want there to be a cut, because that's just what we've come to expect.
You spoke about character performance and in storytelling. What's your opinion on LA Noire?
I haven't played it. I have seen videos of it, but I think that my personal take is that I think mocap is a really cool technology, but honestly, I wouldn't go to it for character performance just yet in the form that it is now. And I think that any motion capture we have needs to be enhanced by animators and, you know, people who work with digital characters to create performances. It can't deliver on its own.
Yeah, I personally felt like it was very high resolution, but the performances themselves kind of feel a little forced.
Yeah.
It was often really clear, oh, that person's lying because they're going.
Yeah, there wasn't a lot of subtlety in that.
Which is why would you do it that way?
Yeah. The hope is that mocap will bring us into subtlety, but if you don't embrace that, then you're kind of wasting it. Okay, cool.
All right, well, one big hand for Ashley.
Thanks, everybody.
Please pick up after yourselves, obviously, so we can have this again, and watch for the next one announced. That's always the second Thursday of every month, and drive safe. And also, if you parked in the garage, make sure you check in at the front desk there and get a validation badge, so you can pay $5 instead of 20 to get out.
I just wanted to say thank you for coming in.
Well, the nice thing is there are so many other resources narrative writing or narrative things like but it's
like there's some sort of I haven't used Slack, but I don't know.
yeah, there's no one over, but if you can create an interactive experience with like multiple choices or just by writing, or just like a almost like a written game.
Okay, I do, yeah, I do podcasts with
yeah, if you can create that interactive example of your work and just say, these are the choices I was giving the player, and show them resolution of those choices. That is, I mean, it really depends on what company you're looking at. Like if you're looking at something like BioWare, like right now,
inspired by games that movie. And I actually had the opportunity
yeah, if only that studio wasn't located in the frozen tundra.
Oh, it's not too bad.
I know a lot of people that have been hard pressured to move up there, so.
I wouldn't.
Yeah, I definitely say just work on
like that video was really showing
stuff that gives multiple choices, interactivity. Anything that can go online.
It's like very nothing was last
So it doesn't matter as long as you have the project very easy.
Oh, yes, I heard about that. He told me he would tell me to go.
Walk away.
So we can go to Firehouse. If it's right there.
I set it to scenario I cited this person, and that's what I'm trying to create the most natural experience.
Yeah, so there's like a lot of smaller things. It's been, but then I'm going to do a lot of
I'm not usually on this side.
I remember seeing your like sorry on the north side, on Facebook. The army side was the north side.
And also just downtown to that one-way street. Like you come in every from I-35 over at
Video now change the scene.
Somewhere no one cares about. Oh wow, there's somebody who actually got does it. He's got a montage.
I know, we'll figure it out.
Yeah, but I think I've made it so people think that like they kind of like talking to them around like a recruiter, essentially having to do with feedback. I get a lot of got my card out, trying to proposition them like the hard idea. I can relate on way too many people. Game developers don't like being associated with it, but if they think they're someone's trying to sell them something, they really do.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And it's really interesting.
It's hard to get sponsorships and watching it. We've had one change once.
It's actually a game. It's called it's a horror game. The idea is that they had a version with a heart rate monitor, and the higher your heart rate would go, the more terrifying the game was. So you had to stay calm in order to get this like horrific nightmare.
Wow, that's like insane like therapy session.
Yeah. They were saying like, oh, it has great information for helping people with anxiety. Like, this is terrifying.
That's almost no VR is using VR to with phobias and stuff, like isolate stuff, like submerging them in like with their headset on and just like putting them on top of a building or a high ladder and that's pretty advanced, but then like you guys are up and talk about how you gotta have like somebody friend that has VR and stuff. That's like
You gotta be careful. Wield power.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thanks for coming out.
It's part of your job.
Would you mind? Can I email you?
Hi. Philip John. First time here in this from where? I was in reading about it.